He asked her directly who killed Gary, and Lena said mom. Today we are covering the disappearance of Lena Chapin and Gary McCullough. This is a really wild case.
It's about a family, essentially. All of it really centers around the mother figure in the family, and that's Sandra Peterson. She has a bunch of kids. 6 children, in fact, all girls, which are named Brandy, Lena, Robin, Jeannie, Rachel, and Rosie. So Sandra was actually born on June 23rd, 1967, and she started dating from a young age and eventually got married 5 different times. So she actually has a bunch of different last names. So Sandra's daughter, Brandy, was the oldest, but it was actually Lena who was really in charge of all of her siblings. Lena Chapin was born on August 29th, 1985. And even from a young age, she was outgoing and confident, but also very stubborn and bossy with her sisters. They would get into serious fights, often physical fights, but they always made up. And there was genuine love between them, and Lena especially was determined to make sure they always stayed together. But the family did not have, a very easygoing childhood, that's for sure. It was actually rather rough because they moved around a lot. As soon as she would move in with a guy or marry a guy, Sandy would get bored after a year or two and then start having an affair with another guy. Still, they viewed her, though, as a loving and caring mom who only wanted what was best for them. And there was one thing that all the girls were sure of, was that their mom would never hurt them or anyone else on purpose.
So Sandy's first husband was Robert Chapin. He was Lena's father, and she left him before meeting the man who would become her second husband, Albert McCullough. Albert adored Sandy. She was warm and charming. She told people what they wanted to hear, and they couldn't help falling in love with her. She was just a charmer. And he also loved her kids. He was a good stepfather and took care of the girls while Sandy went back to school and earned her degree in nursing. But then Sandy started to have an affair, and not with just anybody. Actually, Albert's brother, Gary. So Albert found out about this, and he ended up confronting him about it in front of Sandy, and then they brawled it out. After that, Albert told his brother that Sandy was nothing but trouble and that they should just both stay away from her. But Gary did not listen to his brother's advice, and they decided to go and start a new life together. So on May 22nd, 1996, Sandy moved her kids back to Missouri to live on his farm in Cassville. They got married just before Christmas, December 21st, 1996.
And at that point, Gary went from being step-uncle to stepfather.
Awkward.
Yeah, good God. And despite the unusual circumstances, Sandy's kids really liked Gary. Gary had a day job at George's Incorporated chicken processing plant in Butterfield, Missouri. And when times were tough, he would go hunting after work to shoot their dinner. And together, all of them lived on the farm for about 3 years. And that was as long as Sandy could stay with one man. Because in March of 1999, Sandy started having an affair with a man named Christopher Klemp. He was also younger than Gary and a bit more handsome.
Yeah, plus this guy was rich.
He got suspicious, and eventually Gary caught Sandy with Chris parked in his pickup truck. Sandy also caused serious financial problems. She stopped making the house payments without telling him, and he discovered he was on the brink of foreclosure. He told his supervisor not to give his paycheck to his wife anymore. If she had a note, it was forgery at that point. And that's exactly what happened. Gary was arrested for passing bad checks, which was all done by Sandy, but she did it in his name, so he ended up catching the charge for it. And he knew at that point that he had to divorce Sandy. She was just derailing his life. Even after she lied, cheated, and got him arrested, he was just still more hurt than angry. He started secretly bringing some of his belongings to friends' houses, preparing to leave Sandy. But he never got the chance to file for divorce.
So then in mid-May of 1999, Gary missed several days of work without calling in sick, and his friends and coworkers knew that he would never do that. He was not only too responsible, but they also knew he just couldn't afford to just not show up for work. On May 13th, his cousin Robert McCullough contacted the Berry County Sheriff's Office and told them that Gary hadn't been seen by anyone since May 11th. Detective Brian Martin and another officer went to Gary's farm to do a welfare check, and when they got there, one of the cows was out just wandering around. And as they were leading it back, Sandy pulled up. So instead of telling Sandy that they were looking for Gary, Brian ended up asking her if there was anything she needed to report. And Sandy casually replied and said that she meant to call. She said her husband had gone to Diamond, Missouri, less than an hour away. And apparently he went down there to purchase fighting roosters. He left around 6:30 on May 11th and never came back. And that's all she knew. After they talked some more, she agreed to file a missing persons report for Gary, who was 34 years old at the time.
On May 14th, investigators found Gary's truck abandoned on a dead-end road near Pulaski Field in Berry County. After the police find Gary's truck, obviously they want to do a full search of the property and search the house, but Sandy would not allow it. A week after Gary was reported missing, they finally got a search warrant for Gary and Sandy's house and property. An investigator spent several hours searching and discovered that all of Gary's clothes were gone. And there was absolutely nothing in the house that belonged to him. It was almost as if he had never lived there. Police found a checkbook that belonged to Chris Klemp, who they learned was Sandy's new boyfriend. And within a few days of all this, Chris moved into the house, and investigators decided to search the surrounding wooded areas and dragged the ponds in order to look for a body, and found nothing. Sheriff Mick Epperly asked Sandy to take a polygraph, and without skipping a beat, she replied, "You find a body, and I'll take a polygraph." When they talked to Sandy's children, they were hostile toward the police and fiercely defended their mom, especially Lena. The detectives could tell that Lena was Sandy's number two, and whatever she said, the other girls listened. Gary's brother Albert and his friend Jeff Allen both knew that it was too late, that Gary was dead. The last time Jeff saw Gary, he knew things had gotten bad, as Gary brought over his gun and asked Jeff to hold on to it for him. He explained that on April 30th, 1999, 2.5 years into their marriage, Gary and Sandy were in a huge fight and things escalated, and she actually pulled the gun on him. Gary never kept his guns loaded, but the threat was clear. Literally 2 weeks after this whole incident happens, Gary just disappears without a trace. But at this point, there's no physical evidence that she had harmed Gary at all. Investigators found evidence that Chris had tried to hire a man named Steve Turner to kill Gary days before he disappeared. And in June 1999, he was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, but by August, the charges were dropped. In April 2000, about a year after Gary went missing, Sandy was granted a dissolution of marriage from Gary, and her and Chris got married the following month. Then things take an absolutely wild turn with Lena.
So Lena was in high school at the time and living with her mom and her younger sisters. She was working multiple jobs and trying to save up money. Her sisters, Brandy and Robin, were worried about her. Lena started to kind of pull away from them, and she was barely eating around this time and had a lot of trouble sleeping. She started partying all the time and eventually started doing. She got in trouble with the police, dropped out of school, and started drifting further away from her sisters. And when she was 17, she ended up confiding in her boyfriend that she knew what happened to Gary McCullough, and it was eating her up inside. Her boyfriend told her that she absolutely had to go to the police. Gary's family just deserved to know, but she was too scared and would only agree to talk directly with his brother, her ex-stepfather, Albert. She met with him at his house on June 26th, 2003, and Albert ended up secretly recording the conversation. And after talking for a while, he asked her directly who killed Gary, and Lena said, "Mom." She said on May 11th, 1999, Gary was home with Sandy, and the kids were all at school. Gary was sitting on the couch eating some scrambled eggs when Sandy walked in holding a loaded gun and shot him 3 times in the head. When Lena and her sisters came home that day, Sandy stopped them on the porch, and she said that there were kittens in the field and told them to go find them. Brandy's job was to milk the cows, and she needed to go get supplies from inside the house, though. So while her younger sisters ran to the field, she went in, and she saw Sandy on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor, and she noticed the whole house smelled like bleach. That night, Sandy sat them all at the table and said, "If anyone asks, Gary went to go buy a fighting rooster, and you guys had spaghetti for dinner that night, and you haven't seen him since." After her sisters went to bed, Sandy made Lena sit outside of their door and warned her not to look in her and Gary's bedroom. But she already looked, and she saw that Gary's body was just lying there on the floor. Later, Lena ended up telling her and their other sisters that they would be separated and put into foster care if they said anything about Gary to anyone. And as Lena is explaining all this, she's just trembling. And Albert knew that she was telling the truth. He asked her how they could verify that Gary was really dead. And she said it was impossible because his body had been burned on their farm. And when she was done with her story, Albert assured her that she wasn't a bad person because it was clear she felt really bad. And this was weighing on her. I mean, she was just a kid doing what her mom told her to do at the time. And she feared that her family would be ruined by all of this. He ended up giving the recording of Lena's confession to the sheriff, confident that they finally had proof that Sandy murdered Gary. But Sandy found out about the confession, and she hired a lawyer for Lena, who then refused to talk to the police. So the investigation was stalled. Unless Lena decided to cooperate with the police, the recording was useless. Now all they had were suspicions and circumstantial evidence at best.
Yeah, because it becomes like he said, she said type of thing, and there's no way they can, bring that to a jury. So,
and one inconsistency in Lena's story was related to Gary's truck. She claimed that she had ridden in his truck shortly before he disappeared, and she didn't want to be seen, so she sat on the floor on the passenger side. But when Gary's truck was found, there was so much debris that it was obvious that no one had been on the passenger side in the front seat for a long time. Chris's ex-wife, Jennifer, corroborated at least some of Lena's story. She said that she had dropped Chris off at Sandy's house shortly after Gary was supposedly murdered. When she picked him up at 3:30 a.m., it was like he was a different person. He ran over to her car and jumped in like he was being chased. He looked scared. Investigators believe that Chris had just helped burn Gary's body.
So about 4 months after Lena's confession to Albert, she gave birth to a baby boy, Coulter. And after that, Lena lived only for Coulter. She had a serious boyfriend named Jason Bryant, and they eventually got engaged. And for the first time in her life, she was financially independent, and she didn't have to rely on her mom to take care of her, which was a huge threat to Sandy. Sandy had always wanted a boy, but ended up with 6 girls. And from the day she found out Coulter was a boy, she thought of him as her own son. When she took Coulter out, she introduced him to people as her baby and even had Coulter call her mom. Now, with Lena moving further away, Sandy felt like she was taking her son away from her. Also around this time, Gary was officially declared deceased in 2005. On June 26, 2006, his daughters filed a civil lawsuit for wrongful death against Sandy and Chris, alleging that Lena was an accessory after the fact. Albert was hopeful that Lena could get immunity for testifying against her mother and Chris. Dent County Sheriff's deputies delivered the court summons to Sandy and Chris on July 7, 2006. And Lena had been subpoenaed to testify against Sandy, but no one seemed to know where she was. Robin went to Lena and Jason's apartment in Steelville to look for her, and it turned out he hadn't seen Lena in months. After she disappeared, Sandy told Jason that Lena left him, and that she just ran off to Florida with some guy in a black 2000 Chevy Cavalier. She also left Coulter with her mom, and didn't say when or even if she'd be back.
Which she never would have done that.
That is, yeah. That's just a blatant lie. But Lena didn't take any of her clothes or any of her belongings. She even left her photo albums, which her sisters knew were very important to her. She would never leave without those.
Robin remembered what she had seen outside her bedroom window so many years ago. Her mom and Chris struggling to carry something. She had a terrible feeling that her mother had done something similar to Lena. Sandy had told Brandy the story about Lena running off with some guy, but Brandy knew it wasn't true. She and Lena were very close. They told each other everything. Robin made a missing persons flyer to try to find her sister and posted them all over her town. But she found out that Sandy was actually paying the younger sisters $5 a piece to tear them down. She told her mom that she was going to find out what really happened and make sure she rots. Lena was finally reported missing by Robert Chapin, her biological father, in November 2008. He talked to Sheriff Mick Epperly of the Barry County Sheriff's Office, and when Mick searched the National Crime Information Center, he discovered that there had been no activity on her social security number for nearly 3 years. So he tried to file a missing and endangered report for Lena in Dent County, but officers there refused, and they didn't start investigating her disappearance until 2012.
Sandy, however, refused to cooperate with the investigation at all. Sandy later said that Lena had joined a carnival in Florida and was never coming back. So Jason moved out of the apartment they shared. After he left, the owner found a broken window and a large dark-colored stain on the floor. She tried to clean it, but nothing worked. And when she ripped up the carpet to replace it, the stain had leaked through to the wooden floor below. And later she told investigators it looked like someone had killed a hog there. So it was basically bloodstains. Someone who moved there later on accidentally started a fire by smoking a cigarette in the bed, and the apartment was destroyed by the fire. So at that point, there was no chance of getting any DNA evidence. Robin finally got the courage to talk about what she had seen the night Gary was killed. And she told police she was afraid her mom killed Lena too. Once Lena was gone, Sandy filed abandonment charges against Lena. And when she failed to show up for court, the judge handed over custody of Coulter to Sandy. In July of 2013, a judge heard the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Gary's daughters, April Chandler and Joy McCullough. Lena's confession tape was not allowed to be submitted as evidence, but the jury did hear testimony from Sandy's own children, who implicated her in Gary's murder. 2 of the children had seen Gary's truck parked outside their home on the night he disappeared, and it was at that time that Sandy claimed he was in Diamond buying fighting roosters. The jury deliberated for less than an hour and reached a unanimous verdict, which is rare in a civil case. Even without a body, they found Sandy and Chris liable for Gary's death and ordered them to pay $8 million to his daughters. But in many cases where this happens, no money has ever been paid out.
Isn't that wild? There's like no way to make people actually pay it at the end of the day.
Yeah. But after all of this happened, in 2014, Sandy divorced Chris. 4 years later, in 2018, she remarried for the 5th time to a man named Joe Wink. According to Brandy, Sandy changed Coulter's last name and birth certificate. She also burned all the pictures she had of Lena, Robin, and Brandy and told her younger daughters to never speak of their sisters in front of Coulter.
That's terrible. Literally just trying to erase it from her past.
When she finally told him about Lena, Sandy said she was a addict who just abandoned him.
That's, oh my God, so heartbreaking. This poor kid now is dragged into this too.
Investigators in Berry County and Dent County are still actively investigating both cases. So this is still a very active investigation, and I hope
it's active.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah, that's true. Just because they say it's open doesn't mean they're actively working on it. I think that this is going to be solved. I don't think this is going to be, unsolved forever.
You don't think so?
No. Because Sandy's smart. Clearly she thought through all of this. And you would think that if they haven't found any trace of Lena by now, it's likely that either was put into this well that's been filled in that is just no longer there, or just like Gary, her remains were burned and then scattered everywhere.
Yeah. So, what evidence other than that could they possibly find if they can't to help convict?
Yeah, that's true. What physical evidence is there left?
I don't know. So who knows if it'll ever get solved unless someone has something out there or has that piece of evidence or some camera footage or a doorbell. Well, I guess it's been a while. I don't know. And if you guys have any information out there, contact the Berry County Sheriff's Office at 417-847-6556. If you have information about Lena's disappearance or presumed death, you can contact the Dent County Sheriff's Office at 573-729-3241.
But that is it for us today. We'll wrap it up there.
Keep on taking your mind a mile higher.